everyone. This is Stephanie Vance, and I want to welcome you to Part 4 of the American Association of Museums Online Advocacy Training Series. This is Making Your Case 101, What to Say, How to Say It, and Getting Your Staff and Visitors Involved in Your Museum's Cause. And I know we're going to have more people joining us as we go through the call, but I do like to start right on time. First, we'll share with you a little bit about the online training session, some of the logistical aspects. Who's speaking? I'll share with you a little bit about myself. A welcome from your American Association of Museums Washington team. Then we'll launch right into it with some thoughts on message trends, 5 strategies for building coalitions, getting others involved, and some next steps that you can take right away after the session. About the online training session, what's happening, I know many of us have been on these before, but for those who are new to it, I just want to let you know that basically you are viewing my computer, and I promise I won't go and look at any other sites while we're going through the training session. So this is popped up as a screen on your computer, and you're viewing a PowerPoint that's on my screen. The audio portion, everyone has joined in mute-only mode, so that means that you can ask questions verbally, but I won't be able to hear you. But the best way to ask questions is through the Q&A box, and you should see a little box on your screen that says questions. And if you hit the little plus sign or the little plus sign next to the word questions, that can open up, and you can type questions. And we'll be able to review those. And do feel free to just type questions as we go through the session, and we'll try and stop and address them periodically. Also, many people wonder if the materials will be available after the session. They will. The recording of the session and follow-up from materials will be available on the Speak Up for Museums page. And I'm actually going to take you to that page so that you know when you look for it that you found the right one. If you go to speakupformuseums.org, advocacy_trainings, you will find this is where all of the materials will be. And there's also a link from the front page of the site, so all you'll need to do is go to speakupformuseums.org. And remember, it does take us a little time to get the materials up on the site, so have no fear if you don't see it in a few minutes after the session. It does take a couple hours for the recording to process, so have a little patience, and I promise it will be up there. All right, for those I haven't met, and even for those I have, my name is Stephanie Vance. I am known as the Advocacy Guru. I do a lot of work with the American Association of Museums on advocacy issues, and we've also been working a lot on the Museum's Advocacy Day, which we're very excited to be involved with again upcoming in 2010. So I am actually a longtime congressional staffer, and most of my work in advocacy is predicated on my experiences as a staff person, people coming in to meet with me, and me wanting them to be as effective as possible in their meetings. So a lot of the work that you hear me talking about is what is most effective from the congressional or state legislative or even local legislative perspective. Now, let's hear a little bit from Carla, who is the Acting Director of Government Relations at AAM. And Carla, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And welcome, everyone, to the final session this year in AAM's online advocacy training series. And so far this year, we've covered the basics of advocacy, budget and appropriations, and strategies for building relationships with your elected officials. And today's session will explore how to engage your museum's visitors, staff, and supporters in the public policy process. Now, you already know the many ways in which your museums serve the public, support your local economy, educate students and lifelong learners, and inspire creativity and dialogue in your communities. And in these difficult economic times, the demand for museum services is greater than ever. At a time when school resources are strained and many families cannot afford to travel or make ends meet, museums are working overtime to fill the gaps, providing more than 18 million instructional hours to school children, bringing art and cultural heritage, dynamic exhibitions, and living specimens into local communities, partnering with other nonprofits to encourage national service and volunteerism, and offering free or reduced admission. Museums are part of a robust nonprofit community working to address our nation's greatest challenges, from creating energy-efficient public buildings to collecting food, funding, and other resources for needy families and individuals. And yet, an all-too-common misperception exists among some policymakers that museums are, at worst, trivial, and at best, nice but not essential. It's our job to fix that. because no one knows the work and value of museums better than you do, and it's our job to communicate the public value of museums to our legislators. We're going to learn today about how we can do that and who our partners should be in this effort. And one of the greatest strengths of the museum field lies not only in the diversity of our institutions, but in the diversity of the constituencies we serve. Stephanie is going to talk to us later about how we can collaborate with our partners across all sectors to make our case more effectively. And before I turn it back over to her, I'd just like to remind everyone that advocacy trainings like this one are just one of the many benefits and learning opportunities AAM provides to the museum field. If you aren't already a member of AAM, I hope you'll join us this year. AAM membership benefits include deep discounts on professional development programs, including live and on-demand webinars, plus workshops and retreats, a discounted rate on AAM's annual meeting, which will be held in Los Angeles next year, access to Museum Magazine, discounted rates on more than 300 titles from the AAM bookstore, and access to our information center, which offers expert assistance and confidential, customized guidance on any museum matter. As you can see, there's a lot going on at AAM and many ways for you to get involved. Please visit our website at www.aam-us.org to learn more about any of our programs and services. I want to thank everyone one more time for being with us today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our very own advocacy guru, Stephanie Vance.
Great. Thank you so much, Carla. And we're going to get started here by getting just a little sense of the audience that we have on the call today. The very first thing I want to ask you is how many people are gathered with you to watch this session. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll, and you should be able to pick some of these options. Is it just you? Do you have a couple of people there? Do you have 4 or 5, 6 to 10, or more than 10? And one of the points of asking this is that we want to make it clear that for future online training sessions, you can always invite others to join you. And that's also a great way, frankly, to do a little bit of coalition building. And while people are letting us know that, we'll wait for the rest of the votes to come in. We've got 93% of the votes in. 95%. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We didn't get 100%, but I'll assume some people are frantically clicking and share the results. Most of us, it's just an individual person. Some of us have got 2 or 3 people. But do remember, for future online training sessions, you can actually have others join you, and it's a great way to share some of this information. Then we kind of want to get a sense of where you're starting from in terms of engaging others in the community. So again, I'm launching another quick poll. We want to know if maybe you haven't done much or are eager to start. If you're trying to engage others but want to be sure you're on the right track. If you've done some of this at the very local level, or if you've done a great deal of this. And of course, if you've done a great deal of this kind of work and you have suggestions as we're moving through the presentation here, please do send them via chat or the Q&A box, and we'll see what we can incorporate. We have 93% of the votes in. 94. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results because I think it's useful for you all to know sort of where everyone else on the call is in the community building process. And looks like we have a pretty even split between haven't done much but are eager to start, trying to engage others but want to know if we're on the right path. We've done some of this at the local level. And then we've got a few who've done a lot of this work, and I'm eager to hear your opinions. Read your opinions through the Q&A box and through the chat box. So as we go through, if you've got suggestions, I really appreciate your input. All right, so given that context, sort of where we're all starting from, I want to start by looking at a look at some recent message trends. And the reason why I do this is because I think it's very important to understand when we're thinking about building coalitions and supporting museums, not just in the community but nationwide, that we understand what our audience is thinking about. So I did a little analysis. I went and looked up bills that were about some key issues we've been hearing a little bit about. I don't know if you've heard, but we're apparently doing some work on health care. And in the last 2 years, which was the 110th Congress for the entire 2 years, there were 429 bills introduced. So far, this particular Congress, which has only been 1 year, there's been 778 bills. So that gives you a sense that health care is obviously a big issue. Climate change, for the whole entire 2 years of the 110th Congress, 143 bills introduced, and for just the 1 year of the 111th Congress, 133 bills. So they're almost on track to double their discussions on climate change. Afghanistan, you see also an enormous amount of increase, and financial services, which is a piece of legislation which is going to be on the House floor this week. Again, you see a more than doubling in just 1 year of the amount of discussion that's happening in Congress on these issues. Now, if I look up the word museums, that you'll see in the 110th Congress over the entire 2 years, there were 106 bills that mention that word. In the 111th Congress, there's 56. Now, that's not bad. I'm not suggesting, oh, there should be more, but what I'm suggesting is that if you look at it, museums is pretty much on par with where it's been, maybe a little bit more discussion this particular Congress, but it's pretty much on par with where it's been. While these other issues, healthcare, climate change, Afghanistan, financial services, are rising to the top. It really changes what Congress is focusing on, and the effective advocate will really know what some of these message trends are, because it's really going to help you as you start thinking about community building. Now, you can do the same sort of analysis for your state. I've obviously focused on the U.S. Congress because that's something common to all of us, but you can do this for your state level. You can look at the bills that have been introduced at the state level, or you can even do this at the federal level to just see what some of the message trends are in your own area. So what's the point of this? Why does it matter what they're talking about? To me, the point is that as the context changes, so must your message. You need to be very flexible and have the ability to create new messages as you are talking about museum issues. And getting others engaged in your efforts, your staff, your visitors, coalition groups, will really help you achieve that goal. It's really important to understand that whatever the legislative focus is, whether it's at the congressional level or the state level or even your very local level, that is the bulk of the citizen communications into that office. So the office, not only are there a lot of bills introduced on healthcare, the offices are, using that as an example, the offices are dealing almost exclusively with that issue. So when we look at that in this context, we've got a couple options for how we get messages across. You can either be successful or unsuccessful. You can either try to move museums higher on the agenda, which I think is very, very difficult. I think it's very difficult to get people to talk about museum issues when they're trying to deal with some other issues that everyone's very much caught up in. Or you can tie museums to the hot issues of the day. That's much easier and more effective. So this is why we do this research looking at message trends, so that we can see if there's a way to tie museum issues into some of these top trends. So how do we do that? I know you're all dying to know. I actually looked around at some museums that I could find on the internets. We started with obviously looking at some medical museums. Now, they've got it easy, right? Because if you're talking healthcare reform and you're a medical museum, and I'm going to go to a museum I found here that talks about medicine in the United States. And so this is, pretty easy. You can go to a legislator and say, hey, we're talking about healthcare and we're a museum that handles this kind of issues. But there might be opportunities to talk about museums that have been impacted by that economic downturn. For example, looking at having to cut back on hours, programs, or staff, or that the way that you all have been engaged in social service programs and activities to help your surrounding communities. And this was oops, excuse me for that. I had a link here to LA Art Museum relaunches after a recession-era rescue. So this was a story about an art museum that was having problems during the recession. Or you can look at museums with international collections and programs. I was searching on museums in Afghanistan, and I found a collection of Afghani jewelry that was at a museum. Museum exhibitions and programs on building and sustaining green communities. There's all kinds of ways. This is what's so wonderful about museums. To me, there's all kinds of ways that you can link your museum issues to the hot topics of the day. It doesn't have to be just the kinds of things that you have programs on as a museum. It can be the work that you're doing in the community. It can be how you're connecting to others. So some potential everyday connections to some of the hot issues of the day. Reduced income, loss of sponsors. You may be taking steps at your museum to reduce your museum's carbon footprint, and that might connect to climate change legislation. You might have issues with providing health care for your employees, so that connects to the health care debate. providing services to returning or deploying service people and their families, again connecting to Afghanistan, providing critical community services, the work you do with blood drives, food drives, after-school programs, serving as voting locations, etc. So think creatively about some of the ways in which your everyday connections might connect to some of the hot topics that Congress is thinking about. And if you want to be more effective at the state legislature, look at some of the message trends for the state legislature and see if there's ways that you can connect there. Another thing you'll also want to consider is how museums tie into the interests of your very specific legislators. So there's sort of a two-tiered analysis that it's important to do. First, you start with the overall message trends. What is the Congress thinking about? What is the state legislature thinking about? Then you're going to want to think about what your specific legislators are thinking about. And there's a couple ways to do this. There's two key questions that you'll want to ask. One is, have they done anything on museum issues? And so what we're going to do is we're going right now to the Speak Up for Museums website. And when you go to that site and you click on Contact Congress, you'll see that there's an opportunities here for you to send letters to Congress on a variety of issues. If we click on Legislators, we can find your specific legislators. So for anyone who wants to know if there's a specific legislator here that we should look up, go ahead and type in a zip code or a last name if there's a specific legislator you're interested in. So type into the Q&A box either a zip code or a last name. And while I'm looking up these zip codes, I should note one of our participants has suggested some would say it's fortunate that museums are not the subject of too many bills, which is true. Thank you for that. All right, so we've got a zip code here. I'm going to pick the first one I got, which is 64118. And we're going to hit Enter. And you'll see when you do that, you get your legislators. And you'll see that you also get your state legislators here. So it's not just your federal legislators. You can use this to find your state legislators. And let's say we wanted to learn a little bit about Representative Graves. So we'd click on that link, and we pull up his legislative information here. We can see who some of his key staff people are. And we can also click here to see what some key votes are. If there's not been any key votes lately on museum issues, so we can click there to see that. Importantly, we can also look at biographical information, so we can see what some of his background is. He's a farmer, so any museum, any programs you have at your museum on agriculture issues might be of interest to him. And we can see a little bit about his district map here, and that's going to take a moment to pull up, hopefully. It's showing up on my screen, but it may not be on yours. Sometimes there is an issue with the way the Java buttons pop up there. I apologize for that. But you can click on District Map, and it will show the different areas of his particular legislative district. We can click on some of the bill connections to see whether he has supported particular pieces of legislation, and he has supported the Artist Museum Partnership Act. And we can also see his committee assignments, so we can learn a little bit about some of the issues that matter to him. So we see he's on agriculture, he's on small business, he's a ranking member, and he's on transportation and infrastructure. So this will tell us a lot about the kinds of things that he is interested in. Another way to do that is to look at congress.gov, and we'll go to the congressional website. And now we'll look up Mr. Graves here, since we were using him as an example. And we can see what bills he has introduced. And so this is going to tell us a lot. He's introduced 11 bills, so this is going to tell us a lot about things that he cares about. And I think there's a fair amount of things that you can make a connection with him on. So for example, if we look at the Toys for Tots literacy program, if you've been involved with any local community efforts on Toys for Tots or other things to help children, you might mention that to him. He's recognizing the role and contributions of America's teachers on civic, cultural, and economic well-being. That sounds like it could be connected to museums. So the point here is that if you understand a little bit about some of the bills that he's introduced and the issues that he cares about, you're going to be able to develop a message that might resonate a little bit better with him. Now, anyone can do this for their specific legislators, and actually, I've got one here that I want to look at. says, I've got a comment that both my senators, Kyl and McCain, don't want to be engaged in these issues. Let's actually go to look them up just to see if there's a way that you might be able to frame some of these issues in a way that will capture their attention. So we're going back to the Speak Up for Museums. We're clicking on legislators, and let's look up Mr. Kyl, just for the heck of it. All right, and we're going to show legislator detail for Mr. Kyl. And if we do that, we see a little bit about him. We see some of his biographical information. So he's a former attorney. And you might see that he's from Phoenix, born in Nebraska. If you know anyone from Nebraska, that might help. If we look at the committees that he's on, we'll see that he's on finance and judiciary. So there might be some connections there that you can make. If we look at some of the bills that he's connected with, well, we don't see that he's connected with any museum bills yet. But if we go to the Thomas website and we look up some of the bills that he has introduced, we might be able to see if there's some connection we can make for him on museum issues connected to the issues that he already cares about. So let's go there. We see he's introduced 63 bills, so this also includes water amendments as well. I'm sorry, water amendments. I saw the word water. This also includes amendments to legislation as well. But if you look at this, you'll see he does have a variety of things that he's interested in, and some of these might be things that you can make a connection to. Maybe not the suspension of duty on FOSMET technical, but maybe you can make a connection. Maybe if we see here, if we scroll up, he'd introduced a bill on the White Mountain Apache tribe. If you're doing any sort of programming on Native American issues or Native American programs, he might be interested in that, and that might be able to be a connection for you. So again, I know it's probably going to be hard to turn Senator Jon Kyl around, but knowing a little bit about some of the things he does care about might sort of move you a little bit further down that process. And the other thing I always suggest is, even if you've got someone who you don't think is ever going to actually be on your side on issues, it's always a good idea to continue communicating with them, because you might be able to switch them, and at least you're taking up a little bit of their time. All right. So we've talked about message trends. So we've talked about looking overall at what the Congress or a legislature is doing. And again, remember, I'm giving the Congress as an example because that applies to everyone on the call. But you can apply these same techniques to looking at your state and local issues. And now we've also looked at how this ties into the interests of specific legislators. To me, what really matters, the reason why we're looking at these message trends, is that it's going to really help us understand our audience. And then we start to think about how staff, visitors, potential coalition partners can help deliver that message. And this is how I start in talking about coalitions. I think a lot of people think of coalitions as, let's bring a bunch of people together that agree with us on our issues and go talk to whatever legislative organization we need to talk to. I instead think of coalitions as, let's look at our audience, find out who our audience listens to, find out what our what our audience is most interested in, and then find a group of people, a coalition that would be most likely to influence that audience. So this is why I spent a fair amount of time looking at message trends in the audience, because I think that's really going to help you pinpoint who would be the best members of your coalition. All right, so I'm going to move on to talking about coalitions. Before I do that, I'm just going to double check in and make sure that we don't have any questions at this point. Right now I do have a question. Can you show again how to access the Library of Congress Thomas website? It's actually congress.gov is the site there. So I'm going to type that into the chat box so you have that. You'll also be able to access that from the PowerPoint. And it's congress.gov. And that's all you need to type in to get to that Thomas website for anyone who is asking that question. And I don't think we have any additional questions at this point. I do have a clarification from the individual who was mentioning Kyl and McCain. They made it very clear that they won't add museums or anything else to build on a different subject, this came as a response to the request for support for the transportation museums. You know, the Senate, I'll just mention to you, the Senate has very strict rules about germaneness, so that issues have to be germane to specific pieces of legislation. So sometimes they are bound by the rules of their particular chamber. But hopefully in looking at some of the things that they're interested in, you might be able to engage them a little bit better. All right, so participating in coalitions. Imagine that the box is a member of Congress or your state legislature or even your local city council person. And if it makes you feel better, you can imagine that person in a box if you'd like. With coalitions, you have a variety of people seeking to influence him or her, all from different angles, and coalition members can also help each other. So this is why I think coalitions are so important, not because it's a big, warm, fuzzy group of people who like each other, but because each coalition member should be able to bring something to the table in terms of influencing the specific audience you're reaching out to. So where can you find coalition partners? The good news is that they're everywhere. You already are engaging with all kinds of different groups in the community, outside of the community. You're doing exhibits on all kinds of different current events, healthcare, healthy lifestyles, climate change, diversity, the recession, financial services. You can look to partner with some of the groups that you're putting together some of those exhibits on. You really want to look at building this coalition from two angles: who you're already working with and what your audience is likely to respond to. So if you start looking at staff, visitors, friends, trustees, volunteers, corporate sponsors, groups leading other community causes, you'll see that there's a whole range of different opportunities to identify coalition partners. And to help you do that, I wanted to look at a few examples. And I should mention that for most of the examples I found, I actually found them from the AAM's membership directory, and I'll show you in a moment how I did this. But I wanted to show you some examples of coalitions in a national context, and then a couple in a more local context. So this is the National Women's History Museum, and if we look at some of their existing coalition partners, we click here on the National Coalition, we'll see that they have a huge, huge range of coalition partners. And you know, I'm not going to read all these to you, but the College of Nurse and Midwives, School for Public Administration, Library and Information Science. And as you look through this list, you can start thinking about which one of these coalition partners might be influential with a particular legislator. Let's say, for example, that for some reason we were trying to influence Congressman Graves, who we looked at earlier. And we saw earlier that he was he's the ranking member of the Small Business Committee. Well, if I look through my coalition partners, and I found here the Business and Professional Women Foundation, I might think to myself, they could be a good group to reach out to someone who's on the Small Business Committee, because they're looking at many of these issues from a business owner perspective. If I had, for some reason, found out that my legislator used to be a Delta Kappa Gamma, I might try to get the Delta Kappa Gamma Society to go talk to her. And you can sort of see how this works. If you see you have a legislator who's very interested in helping women or helping young women convert to leading productive lives, you might get someone from Girls Inc. to be engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look at our coalition partners and we start looking at them in the context of our audience, it can actually be a whole new way of approaching them. The next example I want to look at, and I hope we have someone from the Brooklyn Kids Museum, because I thought your website is great. I actually went and looked at the Brooklyn Kids Museum website and just started clicking through, trying to see who some of the supporters were, who some of the potential coalition partners might be. Now, obviously, because they're in the New York area, it makes it easier for them to interact with financial services firms. But if you take a look at this list, I'm willing to bet that many of these groups are engaging with legislators really on an ongoing basis, and particularly in the last few months on financial services legislation. And So it might be an opportunity for a museum director to connect with some of these corporate members and say, hey, you know, in addition to some of the support you've given us, which, by the way, we know that you've had to reduce, we're wondering if you might be able to help us out legislatively on some of the issues that we're working on. And I want to make it clear as we look at this that these are great potential resources for a coalition. They can be different from volunteers and community partners, though. You know, if we look at corporate partners, they might be a different resource, but make sure that you're looking at all of the available options. I'm not saying only look at corporate partners, and I'm also not saying only look at volunteer and community partners. Make sure that you're looking at the entire panoply of groups that might be engaged. Another example I wanted to give was this one, the organization that's working on the Fallen Heroes Memorial. And the reason why I thought this was important is because it connects so much to one of the hot topics, obviously, Afghanistan and some of the issues of war around the world, obviously, not just in Afghanistan. But if you take a look at this and you look at this list of donors who contributed some money, some of these individuals or some of these groups might be willing to communicate with legislators, even just to let them know, hey, this particular museum has done some tremendous work on our fallen heroes memorial. And this would be, for example, a perfect thing to ask a member of Congress to submit a statement to the record about. And even if the museum operator is not, director is not comfortable doing that, it might be something to ask some of these potential coalition partners to do. Now, there's also a huge range of other museum coalition examples. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to hopefully unmute Ember's line because she's got a few things that she wanted to say about some of these groups. And Ember, go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
I can. Make sure you speak up very loud.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Stephanie. So far, Stephanie's given us some great examples of individual museums across the country and the partnerships and coalitions they've built within their communities based on their legislators and what they're focused on in their museum at the time. But we also wanted to share some examples of situations where several museums in a city have banded together to get messages out on a common cause, and that's what the list on this slide is. So it's a sampling from around the country of well-established cultural consortia and coalitions and their websites, and those are links that that after the session you can click on individually and get more information about each of their specific missions and operations.
And Ember, I'm sorry, I have a note from someone. It's a little hard to hear, so again, if you can really just cram the phone up to your face.
Okay, I'm trying. Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Okay. So what we can say in sum about these groups, the Denver Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, Museums in the Park, and the Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, is that they've developed for various reasons and have differing structures, but they share a common theme. They have a unified, organized voice around issues that they all face, and in some cases that may be somewhat unique to the fact that they exist in a common locality. In Denver, for example, they needed a way to distribute tax income equitably across the 7 counties, the cultural institutions in the 7 counties that make up the Denver metropolitan area, because they were funds were being generated by a 1%, 1/10 of 1% set aside in sales tax that is earmarked directly to cultural institutions. So they needed a way to organize themselves and distribute those funds that were being generated by shoppers in their city. In Philadelphia, museums and cultural attractions felt a somewhat shared sense of being a bit of an overlooked Eastern Seaboard jewel that maybe people weren't quite aware of everything that there was to offer for cultural travelers, visitors, and locals right there in Philadelphia. And so they banded together to have a unified voice for partnering with their CVB, their Convention and Visitors Bureau, to really highlight what they have to offer in that area. And in San Diego and Chicago, these are museums that are right in their city centers. And so they were encountering some specific common issues related to operating in that location. For example, example, if other groups or the city was putting on a festival, it might inadvertently block access to the museum's parking lot or entrances during what should be normal business hours for the museums. So to have a unified voice and ensure that they were being as effective as possible in communicating with their municipalities, they realized that if they could combine forces, they could have a more effective message. So the bottom line here is that there's strength in numbers. In each of these cases, the collective of museums has found model ways to pool their infrastructural and administrative resources, their collective assets, and various connections to legislators and local officials across the board, and other connections to have a more effective message, to support each other's common goals, and make sure they weren't duplicating efforts. And what they found overall is that when they come to their local and federal legislators with a unified voice, they have a much larger impact. So we just wanted to make sure that people had access to these examples as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Amber. And for folks who are wondering, how can I see all those, the PowerPoint will be available after the session, and you can actually click on these links, and you'll be able to visit all of those options. And I think it's just great to recognize that you already have a ton of different coalitions that you're already working with. And so part of the work today is to just figure out how to better engage them in advocacy-related efforts. And I'm going to go ahead and mute your line, Amber. And all right, so if you want to find other examples of coalitions, it was interesting to me because the way that I actually tracked some of this down was using AAM's membership directory. And I'm actually going to show you what I did just if you want to see some examples of coalitions in other areas. Basically, all I did was it was sort of a hunt and peck. I didn't actually search on the name coalition, but I, for example, would click on, I'm going to look at all the different children and youth museums in the directory. And so when I did that and I clicked on search, I just would start clicking around at random, which is how I found the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and I went to that website. And then when I went to that website, and I know we've got folks from the Children's Museum on the call, so hopefully they don't mind that we're using them as such a fabulous example. You know, what I thought, well, this would probably be under About Us, and so I clicked on supporting the museum, and this is how I found who some of the people are that are already supporting them, and that tells me who might be outstanding potential coalition partners, not just for supporting the work of the museum, but also for promoting the museum in an advocacy context. So it's a pretty quick and easy way to use the existing museum directory, and I hope you all, if you're sort of curious about the potential coalition partners that you might find with other groups, or even with your own, you can look at some of these options for some various ideas. Now, I had a question about the congressional statement that I mentioned, and I do apologize that I didn't explain that further. I know we've talked about it in other sessions, and for those who it's a repeat for, I promise it won't be too painful. But basically, there's a section of the congressional record called the Extension of Remarks. And in the Extension of Remarks, members of Congress make statements about pretty much anything they want to. And actually what I'll do is I'll just take a minute here, since we did have an interest in congress.org. I'm going to take us, I'm going to take us over to that website again. And so this is, I'm sorry, congress.gov. Did I say .org? Congress.gov. This is the Thomas website. When you type in congress.gov, you'll see that it comes up as thomas.loc.gov. You can type either into your browser. I just find that congress.gov is easier to remember. So if we look at the congressional record, and I'm just going to show you some examples of what the extension of remarks are. But you see here there's something called the extension of remarks, and if we click on that, we'll see this is where members of Congress can submit statements on anything that they're interested in. So the deployment of the Tennessee Army National Guard's Cavalry Regiment, Director Robert Parker of, Director of what, I'm not sure, but he's been honored. You can actually, the AgriLife Research and Extension Center, this should be an interesting one. We'll just click on that. So this is a statement honoring this particular Research and Extension Center. And I don't think that Ted Poe woke up in the morning and said, wow, I think I want to honor this particular organization in my district. I have a feeling someone in his district asked him to submit this statement. And you'll see it's a very, very short statement just about what the work that the organization is doing. Every museum on the planet should be able to ask their legislators to submit something like this as it relates to their particular museum, because you know, you've got different programs that you've got going on and all kinds of different things that are connecting to the hot issues of the day that Congress is considering. All right, so that was the congressional statement thing I mentioned, and let me go back to where we were here. All right, so we've talked about how you might find some coalition partners, where you might look for them. I want to talk a little bit about how to approach them, some ideas for utilizing them, and then coalitions into the future. And we have about 10 minutes to wrap this up, 15 minutes to wrap this up. So for approaching potential coalition partners, obviously the best and easiest approach is to ask them to join. Most people forget to make that very simple ask. We talk a lot about, wouldn't it be great to have a coalition? A coalition would be nice. But we don't actually take the steps to actually ask someone to join in the effort, so asking is critical. Remember to think about who on your staff or board or of your corporate sponsors or of your volunteers or of your community partners are best positioned to ask different potential partners to the table. So if you decided you do want to create a coalition, think about who you know that might be able to approach some of the people that you're interested in having join the partnership. Again, this is similar to knowing your overall audience, your legislative audience, but it's really in figuring out, for example, if you know you want to get a particular financial services individual group engaged, how can you find the right person that you already know to approach that particular financial services firm? This is just an example. Another idea for approaching potential coalition partners is what I like to call is the kick in the pants approach, which sounds a little odd, but the example I always give, I used to work for Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and whenever he wanted to move forward on a particular legislative initiative, he would convene a meeting of all of the groups that he thought should be interested in that particular piece of legislation and ask them to form a coalition. And believe me, if a member of Congress is asking you to form a coalition, you probably go ahead and do it. So if you've got an elected official that's already a champion for your issues in your community, it's a great opportunity to reach out to him or her and ask if he or she'd be willing to convene a meeting to try and get people engaged. All right. Materials, once you're approaching them, what do you need to give them? I think it's important to have sort of a one-pager. A concrete idea of what you want the coalition to be, but you want to be flexible because remember when you're approaching partners, you really want them to be partners with you. So you want them to sort of recognize that they can have some input into what the coalition would do. On that one-pager, you're going to want to sort of express what's the mission of the coalition, what will you want coalition members to do, and be as specific about that as you can. You may want them to approach legislators, whether at the local, state, or federal level. You may want them to promote museum programs as part of their ongoing outreach, whether they have newsletters, etc. You might want them to promote your museum with their advocate. What resources will coalition members provide to one another? Making it clear, you know, if you've got a great mailing list, we hope that you would be willing to make that part of the coalition. And you need to be sort of clear if there's a single goal for the coalition or if it's sort of a broader strategic alliance sort of situation. The single goal is usually something along the lines of, you know, we want this particular level of funding, or we want this particular new facility to be built. Sometimes you also build coalitions that are more broad strategic alliances to increase awareness of museums. You want to be pretty clear about what that particular goal is for the coalition and whether it's going to be very focused or more expansive. In utilizing coalition partners, you always, as I've mentioned, want to establish a mission and goals. You never, never, never want to be unwilling to review those missions and goals. Remember that, again, when you're trying to create partnerships, you want to make sure that you are listening to what they think are important components of those partnerships. You want to identify some specific tasks based on those goals and make assignments based on strengths and connections. And I'll show you a coalition intake form in a moment that will really help you figure out who will be best at what specific task. And I know this will give people heartburn, and some people like to take issue with me on this. Sometimes it's good to have a meeting with your coalition just to meet. The point is not to waste people's time. Obviously, we're very all sensitive to that. But it is important to bring the coalition members together on an ongoing basis. If it's not urgent, maybe you can do it quarterly, but it helps to keep the lines of communication open and make sure that you are establishing an agenda for every meeting that does make a good use of the coalition's time. All right, some materials for utilizing your coalition partners. I think it's very useful when you're starting your coalition to start a power map. And what I mean by this is figuring out, and you can usually keep this on sort of an Excel spreadsheet or that sort of thing, but who the members of your coalition have the most influence with. So if you know who your audience is and you know what their interests are and you're starting to build your coalition, just help make sure you've written down somewhere, perhaps again in an Excel spreadsheet, who has the best connections to who and why. So if you know, as we use the example of Congressman Graves from earlier, if you know he's very interested in small business issues, you know you've got small business members of your coalition, make sure that you're always remembering that that connection is there. Now, one resource, that can help you with this, and this is actually on the Speak Up for Museums website. And again, if you want to make sure you can get directly to this form, after the online training session, you'll be able to access these links through the PowerPoint. But this is a coalition intake form. It's a form that you can use to get the name of the organization, address, city, zip, etc., figure out a little bit more about where they heard about the effort, write down some information about their structure, how many members they have. This is very useful because when you want to do advocacy and you know how many members are connected to the people in your coalitions, you can actually make the point that to legislators, hey, we're a coalition that represents this many people. So if you know you've got a member in your coalition that represents 400 other people, you can talk about those 400 people as someone whose interests you might be representing. Obviously, some of these other questions, experience with advocacy campaigns, do they have connections? And then this is really important because it helps you understand what resources they bring to the table and what activities the organization might be willing to undertake for the particular effort in which you're engaging. This is good information to get up front because this is not what you want to be scrambling for in the middle of some legislative emergency. It's great to get this up front as you're starting to approach some of those partners. And again, this link is available in the PowerPoint and will be available online. It's on the Speak Up for Museums website. All right. Now looking at coalitions into the future, and basically, if we start looking at, maybe you've formed a coalition, you've achieved some goals, you're not really sure what to do with it. Once a specific mission has been achieved, don't disband. Find some new goals. It might be that you've achieved some sort of state legislative initiative. Maybe you want to look at a federal legislative initiative. Maybe you want to look at something very local. But find some new goals because that coalition can be very useful for you looking into the future. Maintain contact. Again, I think it is important to have a periodic meeting. Maybe it's quarterly when there's nothing enormous going on, but just to bring people together and to continue to identify opportunities for the coalition to do some more work. And consider growing a coalition developed for a single person into a purpose into a strategic long-term alliance. The example I can give here is, it's not from the museum world, but I know Carla's got one from the museum world. The example I can give quickly is the National Alliance for Public Transportation Advocates. This was a group that formed together solely for the purpose of increasing transit funding in the transportation reauthorization legislation several years ago. Once they achieved that goal, they could have sort of disbanded, but they decided, no, we're going to sort of stick together because it was a long-term alliance that made a lot of sense for raising the profile of transit-related issues in the legislature. This is a group made up of about 400 different organizations all over the country, represents about 25,000 individuals, and they represent all different aspects of the transportation-related debate. Some of them are in it because they're for the environment. Some of them are in it because they want more access to services for people with disabilities. Some of them are in it because they want to save money. I mean, they have all these different reasons why they're into it. But their main purpose in coming together was to increase the funding for public transportation and then convert that into a longer goal of raising the awareness of transit issues at the federal level. And Carla, I know you had an example to give from the museum world, so I'll turn it over to you so that you can talk a little bit about that point as well.
That's great, Stephanie, and that's a really fantastic example. And I'll be brief because I know we're running short on time, but one example I wanted to give that relates directly to our field was back during the culture wars in the 1990s when there were proposals to significantly cut funding or even eliminate the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. A coalition of several arts, culture, and humanities groups, including AAM, coalesced to fight cuts and attempts to dismantle the agencies. And this group, which became known as the Cultural Advocacy Group, decided to stick together even once those culture wars had subsided and the NEA and NEH remained in existence. And the coalition realized that they had created a powerful group for mobilizing and advocating on behalf of our respective communities. And so they continued to meet, but just shifted priorities in the long term. And now this group that continues to meet today gets together on a monthly basis and advocates for greater funding through the annual appropriations process and helps support public policies that help sustain and grow our communities and our work. And they're also able to quickly mobilize our respective fields in the event that arts, culture, or humanities are ever threatened in public policy. And just to reinforce Ember's earlier point, when you have a broader coalition like this with a greater pool of resources and a much wider network coming to speak to legislators with a unified voice, it really, really augments our impact. So thank you, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you, Carla. And I think that's a great example, obviously connected to the museum world. And in the last couple minutes, I just want to go over a few key things to remember and then address a few questions that we've got. Remember, it's often easiest to coalesce around one specific idea or message. Support museum-friendly policies is very general. Oppose or support legislation XYZ is very specific. And it's usually easy to start with something specific. You tend to sort of have a very focused goal, and then you can build out from there. Coalition members need to have some flexibility. Sometimes they might want to make some changes to the mission and goals, and everyone needs to sort of figure out if that's going to work for them. Also, connected to that, politics makes for strange bedfellows. You might get to the point where the coalition conversation should really be focused on the specific issues that coalition members agree on only. You may find that you've got members that will disagree with you and sometimes vehemently on other issues. That's okay. Talking about the NAFTA coalition example, there were some coalitions that really wanted to get more funding in particular programs within the transportation reauthorization. Some really wanted more money in the air quality. Some really wanted more money in the disability. Some really wanted more money in the transit to work program. And they all wanted those things as individual groups. As an overall group, our main goal was just getting more money into the transit pool. So we didn't get involved in all the discussions about how that was going to get sorted out. The main purpose of the coalition was to increase the overall funds. And then you want to think about reactive versus proactive coalition building. Not that one's better than the other, but what I mean by this is sometimes you build a coalition because you're reacting to something that a legislature is doing, like they're trying to take away funding, or maybe hopefully even something positive. Proactive coalition building, I guess I should back up and say I do think one's better than the other. I think it is good to proactively build coalitions so that you can be prepared for those situations when there might be some sort of legislative emergency. Now, in looking at that, I actually did have a question on legislative emergencies, and this question is, what is the best way to get an audience with your legislator immediately if your organization is in a crisis? Thanks so much for that question. I think the best thing to do is to, again, look at your legislator, look at the kinds of things that your legislator is interested in, see if you have any partners that exist right now that legislator might be willing to meet with. If it's not a legislator that you have a good connection with yourself, maybe you can find someone who you partner with who would be willing to go to that legislator on your behalf. Because, it's hard to get a legislator to focus on your issues. It's easy to get a legislator to focus on the issues that he or she already cares about. So that might be an option for that particular situation. And then I just want to run very quickly through a few additional questions we had. I know we've got about 5 minutes. And once we get through these questions, I got a couple extra resources to share with you. I had a question. I was talking about the congressional statements, and I had someone ask, didn't really understand why the congressional record statement helped. Does anyone actually read those? The congressional record statement helps for a couple reasons. First of all, it gets your legislators engaged in the issues. If they submit a statement to the record that talks about how wonderful you are, and then a vote comes up at the federal level on IMLS funding, does it make it easier or harder for them to vote against you? It makes it a lot harder for them to vote against you, right? Because they have already submitted a statement to the record about the wonderful work that you do and how much they love museums, and you will, of course, remind them that they have done that, and that this would be, the IMLS funding vote would be a great way to show their continued support for the work that you're doing. Another great thing that you can do with those statements is you can actually print them out, slap the Congressional Record banner letterhead on it, just cut and paste the picture from the website, and send that to your funders, to your supporters, show them that members of Congress are actually talking about your museum and the work that you're doing. So I hope that helps on that question. Next question, are there ever any groups or organizations that you would not want to bring into a coalition? I think that's really going to depend on the connections that you understand with your audience. So knowing your audience and knowing if there's a particular group that he or she is really not happy with, then that's probably going to be a group that you're not going to want to engage in the issues. But it really boils down to knowing a lot about your audience and making sure that you really understand who they like and dislike. Then I've got another question here. Let's see here. So I've got a couple questions here. I've got actually an example of a coalition advocacy created at that time with Partners in Tourism, which advocated the role of cultural and heritage organizations to be included in policy decisions regarding the tourism funding and other issues. And the person who's writing led the organization for 7 years as Director of Development at AAM, and is now led by the National Trust. So that's a great example. Thank you so much for that. And then I just have one last question that I want to address here. How do we take the 20 years of experienced staff and get them to stop repeating, oh, we had this idea 10 years ago. Shall we try to change them, or shall we try to get them engaged in the initiative? And I think that's kind of a good place to sort of end the comments, because I know that in many cases you will have some difficulty in trying to build these coalitions. You might have people who've been engaged in these issues for on an ongoing basis. They've been involved for a long time. They think there's nothing new that you can show them. And so you probably will just have to keep plugging away and seeing if you can have a little bit of success using some of these different techniques. There are some resources available for you. If you, at the Museums Advocacy Day 2010, you can talk a little bit more about this coalition building expertise. You also, there's also been groups that brought representatives who were mayors back at home, or the leaders of the local tourism board, or CVB, or museum trustees, that really had a good connection with the audience, that people managed to bring the partners with them to Museums Advocacy Day, and that really helped make those connections with the legislators. You use the speakupformuseums.org website to send letters to your legislators, and obviously you've got your AAM government relations team. You've heard from both Ember and Carla on the call, and they really are there to help you day in, day out, and I know they're always eager to hear from you. I should announce that Gail is on leave. Most of you know Gail is the Director of Government Relations. She's on leave until early March. Carla is the Acting Director. So this is, if you've got questions or comments between now and March, either Carla or Ember are the right people to connect to. And I promised you I would be done by 2, and I am. So I hope that you got some new ideas out of this. I appreciate you taking the time to be on the call, and we look forward to having you on another online advocacy training session in the future. Take care, and thanks so much.